For this episode, we are joined by Vignesh Krishnan, the Director of Teach for India in Hyderabad. Vignesh, if we could begin with your journey into the educational space.
So Kushal, I actually grew up listening to stories of my grandfather, who I think had the courage to sort of walk hundreds of miles from the state of Tamil Nadu to the northern part of Kerala in the early 30s. This was almost 90 years back, to a tribal village to work with the rich landlord. So for starting the first school, the first community bank for thousands of people in the village, right? So growing up for me, like I was always intrigued by the leadership and generosity of my grandfather. I saw how education sort of has the power to make, a society equitable for people from every strata. And this was particularly to the village that my grandfather sort of worked for many years.
So when it comes to TFI, Teach for India, what do you understand its objective around education to be? When you're the city director in Hyderabad, what are you trying to do there?
There is a huge lack of leadership in the system, right? Like we believe that at all levels, right from the grassroots level to, at a systemic level, we need leaders who are sort of committed, really passionate about education, really want to work towards an equitable access for all children in the country, right? Like, and that's what primarily led to, the inception of Teach for India and like what we kind of stand for, right? Like, and to coming back to your specific question, I think broadly when we think of like education and like what is our role in it specifically, I think we fundamentally believe that like every single child in the country has, need to have access to an excellent education, right? Like, and for us, a lot of our work is geared towards that. And we are more or less like a leadership development organization. We, of course, work in the field of education, but more or less our work in the short term is to ensure that like we get leaders from diverse sectors, people who are working in very different sort of sectors who want to make a switch to education, undergrads and postgrads who are in the top universities in the country. We believe that we need to gear up to get the best talent to be part of the ecosystem. And I think that's the primary work that we do.
This educational space that you're creating here, where you have, well-trained leaders as teachers, what kind of environment should they be creating? What kind of an ethic, culture in relation to their students in that school space? What kind of thing are they trying to create there?
We believe that, every decisions that are made, and that's actually true, right? Like for many countries, every decisions that are made right from a school or an institution level to a systemic level are mostly made by adults, right? Like adults mostly make decisions for children, right? Like, and even if you see at this point, we are in the midst of a pandemic, and like we are hearing all the schools suddenly moving to online schools without really hearing what children need, what their needs are, what do they really want at this point. Does online learning really make sense? If it is online learning, what exactly needs to be part of our online learning, etc. Right? Like, so we actually think that we need to kind of break that whole barrier that's currently there, which is basically not having a voice for children. Right? Like, so one of the most fundamental things that we equip every single individual who joins the fellowship is to basically say that how do we enable every single child to have a voice? Right? Like a voice to basically speak up, right? A voice to kind of question the teacher, question authorities, a voice to basically, make decisions for themselves, etc. Right? Like, and I think that's the most important thing for us to also build change from a bottom-up sort of a lens as well. How do you create a culture where a child can ask questions to teachers? And the Indian education system is such that I remember growing up, feeling extremely, concerned and, worried about, if a teacher asks a question, give a response, right? Like, and I don't think I have ever, in my 12 years of schooling education, have been in that right classroom or in that right lesson where I was, given that opportunity to ask questions. Every time I would ask questions, something shot out, right? Like, and a lot of us have gone through the same education system, and I think that's the big shift that we are kind of trying to build, especially with the communities that we work with, because we believe that like a lot of communities that we work with are already plagued with a lot of violence, a lot of oppression, a lot of like societal issues that they are facing on a daily basis, right? And we want to make sure that the classroom is that beautiful space where they feel like they want to come back every single day. They feel like they want to learn every single day. They want to interact with the teachers. They want to have a community that really supports each other. It's compassion and love that we kind of like flows within the classroom, right? Like, well, of course, it might seem like a very utopian idea for a lot of people, but that's something that we've been like striving for the last 10 years.
When you're trying to work alongside not just parents, but the wider society, the other stakeholders, potentially politicians and policymakers, when you're trying to persuade them to bring about reform, what are the core challenges that you end up facing?
There are challenges both at a micro level and a macro level, right? Like at a micro level, if you see, I fundamentally believe that the challenge starts with each of us, right? Like I think one of the most important things is to change our own mindsets before even we kind of overcome challenges with the rest of the community, right? Like it's very easy to point fingers and say, hey, the teachers are not doing it, or the administrators are not doing it, or the school leaders are not doing it, right? Like, but one of the most fundamental principles that we believe is that for change to happen, it needs to start from self. Like we believe each of us need to change our mindsets, look at every individual's perspective, have a systemic view on like what are the problems, right? Like of course we can list a bunch of problems, but I think this is the core sort of philosophy of leadership that we kind of like talk about to each and every fellow who join the fellowship, right? But to kind of answer your question more specifically with respect to challenges, we have a range of challenges starting from challenges at a household level where a child is not getting enough nutritious food, or challenges at an infrastructural level where we have schools in Hyderabad and we have schools in Delhi and different parts of the country that we work, where our classrooms have a student teacher ratio of anywhere between 1:50 to 1:120. It's as high as that, right? Like, so challenges at a micro level are many, right? Like, there are also administrators and school leaders who don't have enough resources, right? Like, all of them are striving to be, like give their best, but unfortunately, there's a huge resource crunch. If you look at Telangana, for instance, the education budget has reduced over the last, 3 years. Every single year, the education budget has come down. We are talking about preparing our children for future where our resources are already scarce, right? Like, but education unfortunately is not featuring among the top priorities for most governments, right? Like, and that's a big challenge because when you think of like all the great things that we want to do with children, like be it with respect to a systemic level or at a curricular level or at a at a grassroots level more, you need resources, right? Like you need to hire good people. You need basically resources to basically pump in more and more talent into the system. So for all of these things to happen, you need a government, you need an administration which cares for education. Right? And I feel like that's something that it's not a consistent pattern that we are seeing. It's a huge challenge across different states that we are seeing. Of course, there are definitely pockets of sort of like great visionary leaders that we see who have been instrumental in letting us continue the work that we are doing over the last decade. But yeah, that's the broader sort of gist of like when you think of challenges. These are some of the ones that comes to my mind.
I'm just quite curious about this leadership, big focus on leadership within TFI. Because some people that go through TFI don't necessarily go on to become teachers, they take on other roles within educational spaces. What do you think that leadership is providing in those spaces which aren't necessarily teaching spaces? So when they go into, say, board meetings when it's about funding, or they go into policy making, or they go into further research, what the skills that you're equipping them with at TFI, what would those look like in practice?
What we do in the fellowship is a transferable sort of an aspect, right? Like of whatever we do with respect to the skills that you're talking about, right? Like to give you an example, let's talk about like relationship management, right? So we have folks who enter schools who are never interacted with a school principal or a teacher or a community leader or a student for that matter, right? And if you see, all these stakeholders require a very different set of relationship management skills in order for you to break through the relationship, really do the kind of difficult work that you're doing in a challenging environment, right? Like, so the fellowship essentially equips every single individual in a lot of ways with respect to being able to, build relationship, really nurture relationship and know what it actually takes to kind of understand the specific stakeholder and the need of the stakeholder, right? Now, post fellowship, let's say the same sort of fellow who becomes an alumni works at a systemic level directly with the government. Right? Now, if you see working with the government requires same set of skills. It requires you to build very strong relationship with different administrators. It requires you to kind of liaise and also negotiate a lot of things. These are all stuff that fellows have already done in the fellowship, right? So if you see a big part of what fellows do in the fellowship is completely transferable.
When it comes to the educational future, so say these ideas and these values and principles that you talk about come into action at a level which is not which is far bigger in scope than it is at the moment. They become mainstream as opposed to not being mainstream.
Yeah.
What would that look like? What kind of a society do you imagine these kinds of things producing if they were to be as effective as they can be?
So, Kushal, I personally believe that the future of jobs are rapidly changing. Right? Like, and we need to prepare our children for jobs that does not exist today. Now, this is the biggest challenge that we are talking about when we directly talk about, education within the school education sphere, right? Like, so I feel like one of the most critical principles, even before I get into the future, is that like we need to fundamentally reimagine education culture, right? Like, and we need to move beyond, like just the foundational literacy and numeracy conversation. I mean, if you see in India, like it took many decades for us to move from conversation about access, for until the right to free and compulsory education act came in place. A lot of conversation was about access. Right? Like we now move to quality, but unfortunately, the lens that we are using with respect to quality is very myopic. Right? Like we talk about quality from the lens of, like literacy and numeracy. We need to move beyond foundational literacy and numeracy. Really reimagine some of the stuff that we want for the future. Right? Like, so one of the things that I feel like when I think of educational futures specifically, the first important thing that comes to my mind is what I shared earlier, right? Like giving voice to children. Like I imagine an educational future where our children become equal decision makers. Like our children have voice in terms of the systemic changes that we are making every single year, right? Like that's the first important change that I do want to see. The second educational, sort of shift that I do want to see is in terms of talent, right? Like I shared earlier, like there's a huge dearth of talent in the system when it comes to high quality people working in education, right? Like now, if you look at like countries like Singapore or Finland, now these are smaller countries, but one of the bets that they have placed with respect to education is on people, right? Like they basically said that we need high quality talent right from teachers to administrators, right? Like at all levels. Right? Like now that's the shift that I would like to see in terms of what I want to see in the future. Right? The third, of course, is curricular shifts. Now, this is something that's been a conversation for many, many decades, right? And our national curricular framework, which was drafted in 2005, very clearly outlines, like what are the curricular shifts that need to happen, right? Unfortunately, all of these curricular shifts are not really being put in place. Now, which is also the reason why we believe that we need great talent for this, right? Like we believe that we need committed talent working at all spheres in the system to be able to kind of make the vision of education a reality.
What would you encourage people who aren't necessarily formally involved in the educational space as teachers or as administrators, people in wider society, but clearly everybody has a stake in what happens in the educational space? What would you be encouraging them to do? What should they be doing when it comes to addressing these issues? What kinds of things should they be taking up?
Yeah, I think one is definitely listening deeply to our children, right? Like something that we talk a lot about in different conferences and dialogues, but we unfortunately don't put it in practice, right?
Yeah.
It needs to start from home. It needs to start from a parent listening to a child deeply. It needs to start from a teacher listening to a child deeply. It needs to start from a school leader listening to a child deeply, right? And if you see that model needs to flow at all levels. We need to have administrators listen to teachers deeply. We need to have policymakers listen to teachers and school leaders deeply. Right? Now, I think this is the most fundamental aspect of, like gearing towards quality education. Right? Like, I mean, we'll only be able to understand, problems at a grassroots level and also at a systemic level when we have people from various sort of, like doing various roles in the system, right? Like, I think that's the first sort of piece that I would definitely highly sort of recommend, folks who are there. The second part that I would, like mention is also like just in terms of how education increasingly has become a very sort of commodified sort of, like aspect, in the sense that like it's become more like very transactional. Right? Like, I mean, if you look at the e-learning sort of platforms that are out there, or if you look at like any programs out there, most of it has a very specific agenda in mind. They are not looking at the bigger picture, right? Like, I mean, which is the sad truth, right? Like, and I would love to see, like people sort of collaborate more. People kind of like talk to each other more, right? Like organizations work with each other more, right? Like share their resources. I mean, these two for me are fundamental sort of aspects that are critical, right? Third is definitely the mindset shift, right? Like I said, it needs to start from the individual. Like, you can't sit at home and say the education system is really bad, right? Like, I mean, we need to change this. Or even, I keep talking to a lot of parents and a lot of teachers, right? Like, they have a lot of concerns about how the curriculum is and how the assessments are, etc. But very few take, the ownership to sort of, do something about it. Right? Now, I feel like that's the fundamental shift that needs to happen. Like, if you want to see change, what is it you are doing at an individual level? It could be something as simple as saying, let me mobilize 10 other teachers in the school and start a dialogue. Now, change might start from that dialogue. You never know, a new teacher was joining the school, might become extremely inspired by it, take this idea with 20 other teachers in his or her network, right? Similarly, same thing could happen for children, for that matter, right? Like, or it could happen for parents, right? I feel like dialogue is a huge part of, like shift that can happen at all levels, and that's something that we don't often do. So yeah, so these 3, 4, I would say, are critical things that I would love to see in future.